Jenna stared out the car window at the overcast October sky, her stomach twisting with dread. The trees lining the rural highway had already shed most of their leaves, their skeletal branches clawing at the gray clouds. A perfect day for a trip to the lake, she thought bitterly. In the driver's seat, her mother Diane hummed along to the radio, oblivious to Jenna's dark mood. Or maybe she was just pretending not to notice. It was hard to tell with her sometimes. "Aren't you excited, honey?" Diane glanced over with a smile that was a little too bright. "It'll be just like old times, you'll see. A nice, relaxing day by the water." Jenna shrugged non-committally. The last thing she wanted was a day trip down memory lane. Those old times her mom kept trying to recapture had ended a long time ago, as abruptly as her parents' marriage. Now it was just the two of them, stuck in an endless loop of forced family bonding, like putting a band-aid on a bullet hole. As they turned down the long gravel drive leading to Willow Lake, Jenna's feeling of unease intensified. The public beach that used to be packed with sun-seeking families was completely deserted, the rusting playground equipment and weed-choked picnic tables standing sentry over the empty shore. Even the lake itself seemed unwelcoming, its dark water fringed with rotting reeds. Diane pulled into the empty parking lot and killed the engine. "Well, here we are," she announced with forced cheer. "Ready to go for a dip?" Jenna stared at her incredulously. "Mom, are you serious? It's freezing out. And look at the lake. It's disgusting. I'm not going in there." Her mother's smile faltered slightly before snapping back into place. "Oh, don't be such a spoilsport, Jen. A little cold water never hurt anyone. It'll be refreshing." Before Jenna could argue further, Diane was out of the car and popping the trunk to retrieve their gear. With a put-upon sigh, Jenna slowly unfolded herself from the passenger seat and went to help, grabbing the ratty beach towels and battered cooler. As she followed her mom down to the shore, Jenna's eyes were drawn to the thick cluster of willow trees at the far end of the beach. Their gnarled trunks and drooping branches seemed to lean in toward the water, as if straining to reach it. Something about them made her shiver. Diane spread out a blanket on a patch of damp sand and started stripping down to her bathing suit with enthusiasm. "Come on, slowpoke, daylight's wasting." Rolling her eyes, Jenna gingerly peeled off her sweatshirt and kicked off her sneakers. The chill air raised goosebumps on her arms. As she hesitantly approached the water's edge in her suit, her mom was already wading hip-deep into the murky lake, her joyful whoops echoing across the empty beach. The cold was a shock as Jenna stepped in, the water leaching all warmth from her body. She gasped and started to back out, but her mom's shouts stopped her. "Isn't it invigorating? Dive in, the water's great." Jenna highly doubted that, but she knew her mom wouldn't let it go until she fully immersed herself. Taking a deep breath, she pinched her nose and plunged into the frigid depths. The water closed over her head, blotting out all sound and light. It was so cold it burned as Jenna kicked back to the surface, her face breaking through with a hoarse gasp. Blinking water from her eyes, she looked around for her mom. But Diane was nowhere to be seen. The wide expanse of the lake was unbroken, not so much as a ripple marring the surface. Fear spiked through Jenna, sharp and hot. "Mom!" she called out, her voice cracking. Silence. "Mom!" She struck out toward the center of the lake with frantic strokes, fighting the clinging weight of her soaked clothes. The cold sapped her strength and made her muscles seize, but she pushed on, diving under again and again, searching the inky depths. Time lost all meaning as Jenna scoured the lakebed, until her lungs burned and darkness crowded the edges of her vision. When she finally dragged herself back to shore, her body was racked with violent shivers, her skin bone white. She collapsed onto the sand, gulping air, a scream building in her chest. This couldn't be happening. Her mom had to be here somewhere. Maybe she had gotten out while Jenna was underwater. Maybe she was waiting by the car. Maybe a movement at the treeline caught her eye. Jenna squinted through the gloom and saw a figure standing half-concealed behind one of the willows. Hope leapt in her chest. "Mom!" she croaked. The figure stepped forward and Jenna's heart seized. It was her mother, but not as she had last seen her. Diane's skin had a grayish cast, her wet hair hanging in lank ropes around her face. Her eyes were sunken, glassy, and distant. She looked dead. Jenna, the thing that had been her mother, rasped. "Why did you let me drown?" Jenna scrambled backward, shaking her head wildly. "No, no, this isn't real. You're not real." Her mother's corpse lurched closer, rivulets of dark lake water streaming from her bloated flesh to mingle with the sand. "It's your fault, Jenna. You didn't save me. You left me to die." "I tried," Jenna sobbed. "I looked everywhere for you. I didn't want to come here. I knew it wasn't safe, I told you." "Excuses," her mother hissed, her face twisted into something vengeful and inhuman. "You failed me, just like you fail at everything." Jenna covered her ears, trying to block out the horrible words. This was a nightmare, it had to be. Her real mother would never say such things. When she opened her eyes, her mother's body was gone. There was only the empty beach and the dark water, and the heavy, suffocating weight of her guilt. Jenna staggered to her feet and half ran, half crawled back to the car. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe. She just knew she had to get away from this place. But when she wrenched open the car door, her mother was sitting calmly in the passenger seat. Not gray and deadened, but whole and alive, exactly as she had been when they'd arrived. Diane turned to her with a pleasant smile. "There you are, ready to head home." Jenna stood frozen, her mind struggling to process the dissonance between what she was seeing and what she had just experienced. The memory of her mother's lifeless body was still searingly vivid, but the proof of its falseness was right in front of her. You... The lake," Jenna stammered, her voice shaking. "You were gone. I thought you had drowned." Diane laughed and shook her head. "Drowned? Oh, honey, you must have dozed off and had a nightmare. I told you shouldn't stay up so late reading those scary books." She patted the driver's seat invitingly. "Now come on, let's get you home and warmed up. You look chilled to the bone." In a daze, Jenna climbed behind the wheel, her hands trembling almost too hard to grip it. She couldn't understand how her mother could be so nonchalant after what had just happened. Even if it had been a dream, it had felt so real. The cold, the choking water, the terrible accusations from her mom's corpse. As she started the car, Jenna cast one last look at Willow Lake in the rearview mirror. For a second, she thought she saw a flash of something pale beneath the dark surface. A hand or a face silently pleading. Then it was gone, and there was only the road ahead, and her mother cheerfully chattering away as if nothing was amiss. But Jenna knew, deep in her bones, that something in her had fundamentally cracked. A fault line carved by dread and doubt, hairline fractures spidering out to undermine her whole sense of reality. She didn't know if she would ever feel truly warm again. The lake had claimed more from her than she had ever meant to give. And though she couldn't yet admit it, even to herself, a small secret part of her wondered if maybe she deserved it. The trees closed in as the car sped away from Willow Lake, their branches still clawing at the sky. Reaching, always reaching, for anyone foolish enough to venture too close to the hungry water's edge.